After the teachers observed everything that happened during the opening ceremonies, they weren't surprised at what happened afterwards. Whenever the humans entered a classroom, everyone seemed to notice, and it wasn't the heat, even though it did radiate off them. It was actually the smell. Humans sweat in warm environments, something they didn't know. The more body fat the humans have, the more they sweat. The aroma of sweat really depends on their diet, and this is what they all found out quick, especially after the first day, as most every other species have a very strong olfactory sense. They started to ask why humans smell like that, and when they said it was on the diet, they asked the humans to explain. And the humans had to tell them it's primarily the diet, but it also depends on the human. Sometimes it has to do with their internal chemical composition. Humans are different, they said. And this confused the crap out of everyone because they might be homeothermic, but they're not in any type of homeostasis with each other. That was just odd. The humans in every classroom had to say it depends if one is more carnivorous or more herbivorous. As they explained, meat is what makes them smell fatty a little bit. And carnivores love this. Many of them came close and would just enjoy the aroma a little too much, as a few decided to lick at the humans. This made many of them jump, especially if they licked the back of the neck, thinking, oh, the human's not going to notice if I just get a little taste. Unfortunately, this ended up with many of the humans either jumping or spinning around real fast and striking at them. If the human had more of a plant-based diet, the plants tend to remove most aromas, although fruits, if they have a lot of that, makes them smell very, very sweet, and in some cases taste very sweet. Other species that enjoyed this and thought they might get a little taste of the humans would end up licking and then trying to bite. This was not exactly going over well. They found out that when humans are, as they say, burning off fat, as in burning many more calories than they're taking in, or if they're under stress, the odor gets very pungent and not exactly pleasant. And each species reacted differently to these. The humans had to deal with this, and even though now, thanks to their CRISPR program, they were living for well over 200 years, they were still teenagers by galactic standards, and had to learn each of the following species. Since there were 8 of them, they had to go down and remember when they looked at each of them. There was the Bly, a reptilian species that was exclusively carnivorous, with obviously scales and tails with them, and they're tall-ish, about 7.5 feet at most, and then trickle down to about 6. There's another reptilian, but this one's more amphibious, called a slick. At least that's what the humans call them. It's a humanoid, multi-limbed creature with tendrils. Tendrils that not only come out of the head, but also out of the side. Thankfully, these are very much human-sized, as even their females only get to about 5'10" at most. Next was what the humans called the Lati, since they couldn't understand or even pronounce the name. These were a short, very, very white humans, with absolutely ice-white hair and these striking blue eyes, yet they were very short, usually standing around 4.5 feet at best. The shells, at least that's what the humans call them, the insectoid race with 4 different limbs instead of 6, but multi-antennae and 4 small eyes on the face. They had their articulated joints with their shells, but aside from that, most of it was very much covered in chitin. Also around 5 feet tall, which kind of freaked out the humans at first, but thankfully they don't have as insectoid an appearance as you would think, or insect-ish. More humanish, actually, and usually with very, very receptive eyes. There was also the hawks, an avian species that can actually fly, and when you look at them, they're very similar to a harpy. The males, though, are much more bird-like, as they actually have a beak, a very strong beak, and instead of 2 wings, they have 4. Yet, even with this advantage, they are very, very thin and are also very small, standing only 3.5 feet. When you actually look at them, it's not surprising how they can take off, as their wings stretch out easily 6 to 8 feet on either side, not counting the width of the body, and then off they go. They could see one that was very, very smooth to the look, an aquatic species called the squid. They also had some very dark eyes. This seemed to make many of the humans a little nervous, as they all knew about the black-eyed children and to stay away from them. This was also a very thin race, very, very slim, with fins on each of the appendages and one going down the back of the neck, but oddly enough, not on the head. It did have web hands, and the feet were not exactly feet, but more like fins, and thankfully matched the size of the humans. There was the Gel, an insectoid and also reptilian hybrid type of race. This one stood very large, almost 9 feet, i.e., 3 meters up. It was easy to tell them from the shells, mainly because they were different colors. The Gel seemed to be much more colorful, and the shells were kind of a pale blue and green. The Gel, though, also had a lot of segmented scales, a lot of them actually. It looked like Roman armor. And this surprised them because they also had a very, very human appearance with the 4 limbs and 2 tails, although the 2 tails wasn't human. And they also had that same set of black eyes, but this time only 2 of them. The final one surprised the humans, as they thought this one would be an actually homothermic species because they seemed to be mammalian as well, but surprisingly no. These the humans refer to as the tabby, as the hisses and spits that are needed to actually pronounce it are not something most humans can do. This humanoid feline seemed to be mostly humanoid, but did have feline features, still had the tail, and always kept their hair very, very well groomed, as this was part of their culture. They stood about 5 feet tall, but a lot of times wanted to walk on all fours. Then again, many of the other species like to as well. Humans never got this, and it did creep them out, but they did try to make sure that they didn't say anything to offend. They were guests, after all. In one of the classrooms, 2 men, Sven and John, walked into the door right in front of a female named Allie. The men halted at the door, realizing that everyone was staring at them the moment they came in, and of course everything just went silent. No hisses, no flutter of wings, no rummaging of scales or nothing. They just stared at the humans as they walked in. Allie just walked into them. "What? Did you screw up already?" she said. Thankfully, everyone looked at each other and realized that, well, this is just the jitters of the new folks. Everyone took their seats and began class with a teacher known as Miss J by the humans. She was a slick and knows the humans from before. She actually watched one of her own kind try to wrap tendrils around the leg of one of these guys during the opening ceremony. As she began the class, she noticed that the humans were all sitting together. Thinking about this, she knew that humans ran in packs, so this shouldn't be anything odd. But she did notice that the other students were keeping their distance, as they didn't quite understand if humans could be dangerous or anything like that, and of course nobody wanted to offend. After the break, after an hour and a half, the students that were staying away came back in and moved closer to the humans. Not by much, but enough that the teacher did notice. The human students didn't seem to notice this. Yet by the end of the day, the students took seats even closer to the humans. The teacher, Miss J, also saw that some of them were starting to move their tails and tendrils just a bit closer to the humans. She watched the actions of the humans and thought, did they not notice, or they just don't care? It was odd, but it was a long day, and this seemed to be going to be a commonplace thing. After one of the classes a few days later, John asked Miss J if there was a possibility of tutoring. and she didn't have any idea what this was. She had never heard of this word, and he had to actually explain the concept. This was odd to her, as nobody ever thought about taking extra class after the class. Usually, this was a time for either researching something on your own or to relax the mind to make it fresh for the next day. But she tried to disagree that he needed tutoring and disengage for a little bit as she could feel the heat radiating off him. She could also smell him, as it seemed as though he had a bit of stress. The smell was quite strong, but not totally unpleasant. As she tried to say how it wouldn't be possible for her, another student offered. A squid male had walked up and, "Sure, I'll do that. I can help you study, no problem." Although in much, much more words, as that was the way it sounded. The translator took a while, and at first John thought it was like one of those old movies he used to see, where somebody was speaking another language, and about the time they stopped talking, then suddenly it would be in his own language. They always thought it was funny. He never thought he'd get it in 4K. But then again, it is what it is. After they leave, Miss J actually found herself being drawn towards the heat that was still in the room, almost falling over as though her body tried to follow the human outside. The next day, the humans arrive and class started, but Miss J noticed something. That male squid was absent. She didn't bother with it at first. Maybe he was ill. She didn't hear anything, so she just kept going. At the end of the class, she asked where he was. As it turns out, he was in the hospital with a broken orbital. She asked what had happened, and it turned out that while tutoring, this male had seemingly attempted to mate with John. As she asked John exactly what was going on, the other humans were making a weird sound, which she found out to be a light type of laughter. She asked what was so funny, and John had to admit that he would have been into it until he realized that the squid was male. Admitting this, the other two in the room just started busting out laughing and actually had to wait out in the hallway as Miss J could not actually hear anything that was going to be said as they were just cackling up a storm. When she finally was able to get John alone and ask him for details, why, what, how could you confuse that, he simply stated how they had not gone through the biology class yet. And since squid, most of them, unlike her, don't wear a lot of clothes, it was very easy to see that downstairs was kind of smooth. This, by human eyes, made it very easy to confuse the male from the female. Miss J was actually confused at this, very much confused, and then John had to remind her that, again, they had not gone through each other's biology class. "She'll know exactly. Trust me, you'll know exactly what I mean," he said straight to her face. The squid male, when John left, was actually not in any pain for a while, as he was still absolutely high off his ass from the human body heat, and had not felt the pain until the next morning. Then he called for their version of paramedics, and they found out that he may or may not need surgery. Miss J didn't want to hear any more, and she simply told John he's dismissed. She'll see him tomorrow. The details of the incident ran through the school like a wildfire covered in kerosene, and all the students began to ask exactly what the humans desire. This was something they weren't expecting, but they, well, sort of did expect it. Let's face it, these are new aliens, they're confused, they want to know, and let's face it, doesn't matter what species, this is an interesting subject. Unfortunately for most of the aliens there, they only got the same response from all the humans. They want to complete their training, even though it's going to take their version of 2 years to complete. They want to make interpersonal connections. They want to make friends. They want to make connections for businesses later. And they want to understand the other species. Now, this last one was completely understandable why the species were asking the humans what they desire. The kicker is the translator would not actually say what you want to mate with. It was what do you want to accomplish. The translator, unfortunately, made it very difficult sometimes to make sure that everybody knew what each other was meaning. They could translate the words, but let's face it, the meaning can be lost in translation. Within just a couple of days, all the humans had been asked these same questions and had actually conversed with one another. They knew they had to cut this off the past, nip this in the bud, or whatever other stupid expression you want to use. Because of this, each of them decided to stand up in front of the class and explain exactly the deal with humans. They weren't able to stand in front of the class for a while, so they would have to slowly explain over time the history of violence with humans and how men have to learn to be monsters, a beast, a creature of ravenous intent, and then they must learn to control it. This is one of the reasons why, after school, the human males all go to the gym and hang out and seem like they like to throw heavy things around and make strange noises, screaming and grunting. Many of the females seem to watch this and think it's some sort of mating display, yet they don't understand why they insist on calling each other bro. The females, experts in interpersonal connections just seemingly naturally, and also have this seemingly extreme empathy, can manipulate and get what they desire, yet the deception they tend to use can cause society and other personal relations to reject them. Absolutely. So they have to be very careful with this, which is why they're able to talk their way in and out of situations. Those that were listening were completely confused. What, how could it be so different between the two? And why is it like two different things in male and female? Well, that's simple. They would always get the same answer. That's the duality of humans. That's it. Always with a shrug, yet that maneuver tend to be an insult in one culture, so they had to try and not do that. Over the next 3 weeks of school, during class or after class, there was always offers of usually money for someone to come and enjoy the human heat. Now, this usually meant that they would either stay close, they would wrap themselves around an arm, a leg, or sometimes they would be allowed to wrap around the torso, where the core heat was just delightful to those who did it. This turned out to be very, very profitable and allowed the humans a little bit more relaxations. They didn't have to worry about how they were going to get a hold of credits. The only problem was that it tended to get the Xenos a bit high, intoxicated, and, well, for lack of a better term, excited if you weren't watching. This leads to all the humans having a meeting, and they had to straighten all this out before it really got out of hand. The day after this meeting, the humans did get a chance to address each of their own classes. They explained they have no issue with selling the heat, but they have to remind everybody touch does not indicate others to go beyond just absorbing some heat. Sven and John said, for example, we'll teach you. You mind if you help us out, Miss J? Before she could even say anything, Allie said, of course she can help out. Good, but we gotta say something first, John said. It's clear there's something lost in the translators, he said, pointing to the one hooked up to his ear. Now, there's courting somebody for marriage or to bond, I believe that's the word you all use. There's also dating to see if you're compatible to even start courting each other. And there's also hookups, which are strictly an intimate matter altogether. When he said this, he actually knows that every single one of the Xenos got very uncomfortable. This was actually comforting to him because he knows that this subject can be touchy, and thankfully, it's touchy for every single species. He continued, just touch, just you taking in some of our homeothermic heat is not an indication for any type of intimate contact. Understand this. We've already had an incident, at least with me, and I'm sure there's been other incidents I haven't heard of. Even though I take it back, I did hear about a few, and I'd rather not get into it. But right now, since Miss J has been so nice to been voluntold to help us out, if you would, Miss J, could you please extend one of your tentacles to me and one to Sven, please? Miss J was very, very hesitant, but the tentacles that actually came out of her sides, and of course a few that came off her head, those didn't reach, but the ones on her side did, slowly raised and reached out, one towards John and one towards Sven, but she was very, very cautious. As she reached up, she got right about to the bicep area, and each of the guys reached out, wrapped their arm up like they're trying to wrap up a hose or something, and then with their hand they grabbed on to the tentacle so it would not let go and she could not remove it. They needed her to stay there for the demonstration. John said, "Now, this here, what we're doing, has absolutely nothing to do with mating. Right now, she is just accepting the heat, and that's it. It is flowing in. I can actually feel it. Her tentacle was cold. I can feel the heat building up. It's actually going down. It's probably about ready to hit her bloodstream. Understand that this is not an intimate matter, not to us humans. You need to understand this, and if you cannot control yourself, I don't know what the hell your problem is." Miss J, from the moment they grabbed a hold of her, felt the heat. She tried to subdue the feelings she was having as they're talking, but it was starting to get a little intense, especially with two of them. As she starts to get flustered, John continues, "Let me explain. There's different touch for different things. We as humans, there's certain areas that if we allow you access to, then yes, but we're gonna go through all that through a separate class. Understand, this is important for you to know because many of you are very well connected in your own governments, and it could be very, very bad if things go too far or things are misconstrued, misunderstood, or anything like that. It's right now, this, what you see, is platonic touch. It is not in any way, shape, or form mean that we want to give her a whole bunch of pleasure. The fact that this might be enjoyable is totally separate." While John is talking, Miss J is continuously getting more and more flustered. The feeling of the heat pumping into her body, this bioelectric heat that is coming in from both sides of her, is just becoming more and more intense, building up more and more in her system. She begins to breathe more heavy, and it's difficult for her to stand up. At this point, she's grasping on the sides of the podium, making sure that her legs can stay right where they're at. She's trying to stare forward, but the feeling is just starting to blind her, taking over her mind, building up more and more and more and more. And her eyes begin to get very, very wide, very, very focused. Her jaw opens wide up, and her other tentacles on her head seem to be flowing back and forth with more intensity. Allie notices, walks up to the front of the teacher right across the podium from her, simply says, "Guys, hold on a second. Something's off." Allie then reaches up to the teacher's face with both hands, grabs her cheeks with her palms, pulls her in close so she could see deep into the eyes of their teacher, and just as Allie's hot breath goes across the teacher's face, Allie says, "Guys, I think she's about to..." And with that moment, Miss J squeals such a high-pitched noise that if there was glass in that area, it would have shattered. Allie pulls away and covers her ears, and the guys try to pull away, suddenly realizing that they actually pulled the tendrils, which seemed to not help the situation at all. With that, Miss J lifted her head up, sent another burst of sound in, but this one was much, much lower. It was deep and dark and full of all sorts of emotion. And with that, she fell over onto the podium, almost slamming her face down onto it. And with that, they could hear fluid hit the wall behind her and then kind of trickle onto the ground. With that, she was breathing heavy, as hard as she could, trying desperately to keep part of her own sanity, even though she could still feel more and more the sensation. The pleasure was still coming in from her tentacles. She didn't understand what was going on. The guys tried to let go, but they couldn't. She had tightened down her tentacles like a snake onto their arms. They tried to let go, but it's just not going to happen. As both of the guys reached up with their free hand, grabbed the tentacle, and unwound it like you do with a snake, the entire class was absolutely beside themselves. They are just completely befuddled at what they see, and they are amazed at this as well. The two men step back, so does Allie, step back from the teacher, and the teacher slowly comes down from her experience. Her body's not used to radiating off heat, but simply accepting it, and she's still in a stage that she is not able to even focus. The students, in shock, in silence as this is going on, even the humans, like, oh crap, what did we just do? Both of the boys thinking, we are so getting expelled for this. Then, out of the silence, they hear, me next! The students all stand up, and a large blind male, whose blue scales had suddenly gone to a deep, deep blue, said, I'll take the female! With that, both Sven and John jump up forward as Allie backs away, pushing herself actually against the podium, and they stand in front of them. As the students rush forward at the men who have already raised their fists in defense, they suddenly stop. Allie didn't know what was going on, and then one of the students said, I smell death. Allie was confused. What? She looked around and everybody was just solid still. Both men are still in a fighting position, just waiting for anybody to get in place, in close enough where they could strike. And that's when Allie notices. Not only were they ready to fight, but both of these men were laser focused, ready to take down anyone to protect her. The tension in the room was broken as there was a scream coming down the hall. There were several screams, actually, as it seemed like more and more teachers were having very similar reactions, but these were different species, different calls that seemed like a mixture of a squawk and a garble. There was one that seemed like it was purring. There was another one that seemed like a T-Rex was suddenly trying to pass a stone or something. This was messed up, and all the humans just kind of gave each other a side glance, not moving, just their eyes. After everything started to calm down, they heard a scream down the hallway in perfect human English. We've got a problem down here! John simply responded, no shit! Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of this series. Before I go, I need to send out a big thank you to one of my supporters. That would be Brian Kemp. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And everybody else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.